What if I told you that the men who changed the entire course of human history were a group of fishermen, a tax collector, and a political radical? No armies, no government backing, no social media following, just 12 ordinary guys who followed one extraordinary man, and almost every single one of them ended up dead because of it. Now, if you were starting a world-changing movement, this would not be your dream team. But that's kind of the point, because what these men did after Jesus died is either the greatest story of collective delusion in human history, or it is proof that they saw something so undeniable, so earth-shattering, that no amount of torture or death threats could make them take it back. So today we are going to walk through exactly how each of the 12 apostles died. And trust me, some of these are going to make you wince, some of them are going to make you laugh, and all of them are going to make you think. Let's get into it. Let us start with the guy who everybody knows, Peter. Bold, impulsive, occasionally disastrous Peter. This is the man who walked on water, panicked and started sinking. The man who cut off a soldier's ear at the arrest of Jesus because apparently his plan was to fight the entire Roman army by himself. And yes, this is also the man who swore up and down that he would never, ever deny Jesus, and then did exactly that 3 times before breakfast. But here is the thing about Peter, he did not stay that guy. After the resurrection, something in him fundamentally changed. He became the rock that Jesus had always seen in him, even when nobody else could. He planted churches in Antioch and Rome, the 2 most powerful cities in the entire Roman Empire. He preached openly, fearlessly, to tens of thousands of people, and then Rome burned. And the Emperor Nero, who historians agree was one of history's most enthusiastic persecutors of Christians, decided to pin the whole thing on the church. Peter was arrested and sentenced to crucifixion. But here is where it gets remarkable. Peter told his executioners he was not worthy to die the same way Jesus had. So he requested to be crucified upside down. Let that sink in for a second. The man who was so afraid of being associated with Jesus that he denied him 3 times to a servant girl is now so unashamed of Jesus that he is choosing a more painful death just out of reverence. That is what encountering the risen Christ does to a person. And for anyone who has ever seen an upside-down cross and thought it was some kind of satanic symbol, it is actually called St. Peter's Cross. It is named after the man who specifically chose it as an act of humility. You are welcome for that piece of information. Next up, Andrew. Peter's brother and the patron saint of Scotland, which feels like a very surprising career trajectory for a fisherman from Galilee. Andrew had a knack for bringing people to Jesus quietly and without fanfare. He is the one who found the boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish before the feeding of the 5,000. He was the connector, the behind-the-scenes man. He eventually found himself preaching throughout Greece, and he was remarkably successful. So successful that the governor of the region was getting increasingly irritated. The governor arrived home one evening to find that his own wife had converted. You can imagine how that dinner conversation went. Andrew was sentenced to crucifixion, but the governor, knowing full well that the cross had already become a powerful Christian symbol, decided to rotate it diagonally, probably thinking that would somehow make it less meaningful. It did not. Christians immediately adopted the X-shaped cross as a symbol for Andrew, and it ended up on the flag of Scotland and eventually embedded into the Union Jack. The governor tried to strip meaning from the cross and accidentally created an icon that is now on one of the most recognized flags on Earth. Outstanding. Now we get to James the Great specifically, because apparently there are enough Jameses in this story that we had to start ranking them. James was one of the inner circle, one of the 3 disciples who witnessed the Transfiguration, and he was in the Garden of Gethsemane with Jesus during his darkest night. He was a leader in the early church, and by most accounts a phenomenal preacher. He traveled to Spain to spread the gospel, then returned to Judea where he was considerably less popular. King Herod Agrippa, eager to score political points with the Jewish religious leaders, had James executed by sword. He became the first of the 12 apostles to die for the faith. There is actually a tradition that on his way to execution, James encountered the man who had accused him and turned him in. Rather than bitterness or anger, James offered him peace. The man was so moved that he declared himself a Christian on the spot and was executed alongside James. The man who tried to end James's story accidentally wrote himself into it. Now things get a little murky. Philip and Bartholomew traveled together, preached together, and apparently also died together. Or separately, or maybe in completely different places. The honest answer is that the ancient sources on these two are a bit of a mess. What we know is that they were doing extraordinary work in Asia Minor, particularly in a city called Hierapolis. There were healings and miracles, and the crowds were responding. Then the local officials reacted with hostility. Beyond that, traditions diverge wildly. Some say they were crucified, some say they were stoned, some say one of them ended up in Armenia. There is even a version where the accounts of their deaths got so thoroughly mixed up with each other that historians genuinely cannot untangle them. This is actually a really important moment to pause on because it reveals something honest about how history works. Not everything from the ancient world was meticulously recorded. Oral traditions drift, stories blend together, and the church in its early centuries did not always have the luxury of careful record-keeping when it was busy trying to survive. So we hold these accounts with appropriate humility. We know Philip and Bartholomew died for what they believed. The how is just less certain than we would like. Thomas. Oh, Thomas, the man who has been unfairly branded for 2,000 years because of one moment of completely understandable skepticism. Think about it from his perspective. Your rabbi, the man you left everything to follow, was just publicly executed in the most humiliating way the Roman Empire had invented. You watched it, and now people are running up to you saying he is alive. Would you believe that? I would like to think I would, but I'm honestly not sure. Thomas said he would believe it when he saw it, and then Jesus showed up and let Thomas see it. The response Thomas gave is one of the most profound confessions in the entire Bible. He looked at Jesus and said, "My Lord and my God." He is the first person in Scripture to explicitly call Jesus God to his face. Then Thomas did something extraordinary. He traveled farther than virtually any other apostle. Historians and ancient traditions trace him all the way to India, where the church he planted, known as the St. Thomas Christians, still exists today, 2,000 years later. Thomas was eventually martyred in India, killed by a spear. The man who needed proof became one of the most far-reaching missionaries in history. There is a lesson in that for anyone who has ever felt like their doubts disqualify them from faith. Matthew. Before Jesus found him, Matthew was sitting at a tax collector's booth, which in first century Judea was roughly equivalent to working as an informant for an occupying government. He was despised by his own community, and Jesus walked up to him and said, "Come, follow me." Matthew went on to write what became the most widely circulated account of Jesus' life in the ancient world, the Gospel of Matthew. The man everyone hated ended up writing the book that introduced Jesus to more people than almost anything else in history. Classic God move. Matthew eventually made his way to Ethiopia, where Christianity had already taken root through the Ethiopian official baptized by Philip in the book of Acts. But the reigning king developed a deeply inappropriate interest in his own niece, and Matthew had the audacity to tell him that was wrong. The king had him executed during a church service. If you think that is the end of Matthew's influence in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions on earth, still venerates Matthew as a foundational figure today. A man killed for speaking truth to power left behind a faith tradition that has lasted 2 millennia. Now James the Lesser, which, can we acknowledge, is a rough nickname to carry through eternity. Scholars debate whether this James is the same person as James, the brother of Jesus, who wrote the Epistle of James. Jerome, one of the most important early church scholars, said yes, same person. So that is the tradition we are going with. This James was a fixture in Jerusalem. Unlike the apostles who scattered across the known world, James stayed. He preached regularly at the temple, which is remarkable when you consider that the temple leadership had just orchestrated the crucifixion of his rabbi. Most people would find a different venue. James kept showing up. Eventually, the religious leaders had enough. He was thrown from the top of the temple. When that did not finish the job, the crowd stoned him. When that still did not finish the job, someone struck him with a club. It took that much effort to silence a man whose only weapon was his voice. Jude, or Thaddeus, or as he apparently preferred to be called, anything other than what people kept confusing him with. Jude was not Judas Iscariot. This is a distinction he probably had to make approximately 40 times a day for the rest of his life. He even asked Jesus a question in the Gospel of John, and the writer felt compelled to clarify that he was not Judas Iscariot. Being the other Jude was apparently its own particular kind of burden. Jude traveled to either Armenia or Lebanon to preach, depending on the tradition you follow. He was killed either by arrows or by an axe, again depending on the tradition you follow. The ancient sources on Jude are about as inconsistent as weather forecasting. What we know is that he went somewhere dangerous, preached something unpopular, and did not back down. Simon the Zealot. Before following Jesus, Simon was a member of the Zealots, a Jewish political movement that was, to put it mildly, not fans of Roman occupation. The Zealots believed in armed resistance. Simon sat at dinner with Matthew the tax collector, a man who collaborated with Rome for profit, and somehow they were on the same team. That is genuinely remarkable. Whatever Jesus did to these men, it was powerful enough to make a revolutionary and a collaborator break bread together without incident. If that is not a miracle, I do not know what is. Simon eventually made his way to Persia, where, according to the most widely cited tradition, he was sawed in half for his faith. The zealot, who once might have been willing to die fighting for political liberation, ended up dying for something he considered far more important. Now the one that hits a little different, Paul. Technically not one of the original 12, but he is impossible to leave out of this conversation. Paul was, before his conversion, one of the most enthusiastic persecutors of the early church. He did not just disagree with Christians, he had them imprisoned and killed. On a road to Damascus, he encountered the risen Jesus, an encounter that literally knocked him off his feet and left him blind for 3 days. The man who had been hunting Christians became the most prolific evangelist in history, writing nearly half of the New Testament and planting churches from Jerusalem to Rome. When Nero blamed the Great Fire of Rome on Christians and began a systematic persecution, Paul was arrested. In one of his final letters, he wrote with striking clarity that his execution was coming and that he was at peace with it. He was beheaded in Rome. The man who once stood by approving as Stephen was stoned became someone willing to face the same end himself. And then there is John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, the one who leaned against Jesus at the Last Supper, the one who stood at the foot of the cross when everyone else had fled. John outlived all of them. He was eventually exiled to the island of Patmos by the Roman Emperor Domitian, and there, in isolation, he received a series of visions that became the Book of Revelation. He died peacefully of old age, the only one of the 12 to do so. And there is something quietly beautiful about that. The youngest one, the one who had the longest to wait, the one who watched all his brothers die for the faith, still standing at the end, writing the final chapter of the entire biblical story. So here's what all of this adds up to. These men scattered in terror when Jesus was arrested. They hid behind locked doors after the crucifixion. They were ordinary, frightened human beings. And then something happened that turned them into people who would walk into hostile cities, preach to hostile crowds, face hostile governments, and not flinch. Nobody dies for something they know is a lie. That's the point. These were not men who were deceived into believing something false and gave their lives for a misunderstanding. They were eyewitnesses. They were claiming to report what they themselves had seen, and every single one of them, when given the chance to recant, chose death instead. You can dismiss one man's dying testimony, maybe even 2 or 3, but 11 men, scattered across different continents, facing different rulers, dying in different ways over decades, and not one of them cracking. That's not the profile of a conspiracy, that's the profile of people who saw something real. And the question that leaves us with is the same question it left every Roman governor, every hostile king, every skeptical bystander in the 1st century with. If these men were willing to die for it, what exactly did they see? If this made you think, consider sticking around because we are just getting started.